Thanks for joining us for a North Greenville University chapel service.
So you ever been lonely? It's probably one of the loneliest, darkest times in my life. It's probably one of the most terrifying as well. I walked slowly through this crowd of people, and you can be lonely in a crowd. And I heard them whispering to their friends. They were laughing at me, and nobody really spoke to me. They would just yell things like, "Go back to where you came from," and "You must be lost." And so the loneliness began to kind of creep in. I climbed this flight of stairs, and I kind of walked through the crowd and stood right in the middle of this unwelcoming group. And I tried to talk to the other people around me, but they were obviously not wanting to speak to me. And then the crowd of people began to cheer. They started kind of raising the roof a little bit, and I looked around, and it was then that I realized my folly. You see, I'm a Clemson grad, and I had just graduated from Clemson and bought a ticket in the student section of USC Clemson game accidentally. And those of you who might be Gamecock fans who are here, y'all aren't very nice to Clemson people, especially in their student section. However, there was a glimmer of hope. I saw across the way the promised land. And they began to play this song that I recognized, and I began to realize that was my people, and I needed to go where my people were. And so as I began to leave, the Gamecock student section began to cheer for me. In fact, many of them obviously felt like I was hungry because they threw food to me, and they obviously thought I was thirsty, and they threw a drink to me. And it was then that I was able to kind of walk across the sea of people and get around my people, and all of a sudden, the loneliness, it just faded away. Being stuck in the wrong student section at a ball game, that can be lonely, but many of you have experienced a much more powerful feeling of loneliness. You know what it feels like to be closed off in your room while your parents fight all night long. You know what it feels like to sit quiet in your room after losing your virginity. Some of you know what it feels like to sit all alone in your dorm room looking at pictures of a bunch of other people that are kind of your friends having a great time, but for some reason you weren't invited. You know what it's like to lose a loved one. You know what it's like to be misunderstood because you come from another culture that's not in the majority. You're not alone. In fact, according to The Lonely American, which is a book written by Harvard Medical School psychiatrist, the number of people an average American discusses important things with in the last decade has dropped from 3 people to 2 people. 1 out of every 4 individuals said that they had no one to discuss an important matter with. 25%. 1 out of every 10 Americans, listen to this, 1 out of every 10 Americans take some type of medication to deal with anxiety and depression. The elephant in the room is loneliness, and it's killing us, literally. In fact, Vivek Murthy, the former Surgeon General of the United States, said that the most prevalent health issue in the country is not cancer or heart disease or obesity, it is isolation. He said this years ago. They said this years ago. Depression may be linked more to isolation than to chemical imbalance. You see, the elephant in the room of the American church is loneliness. And in the midst of a pandemic, it only heightens the feelings that are already there. Tonight, I want to look at 2 passages of Scripture. If you got a Bible, you can flip there and just mark it with your fingers, or if you've got your digital word, you can actually flip back and forth pretty fast. But Those two passages are Psalm 22 and 1 Samuel chapter 30. Listen to these words that David pens. My God, why have you forsaken me? Probably sounds familiar to you. You see, David had a lot of lonely times in his life, and that tone can be felt in these words that he pens. And one of those times is recorded in 1 Samuel chapter 30. Let me just lay out the story for you. You've heard of David, right? David defeated Goliath, and when David defeated Goliath, his approval ratings are sky high. Everybody loves him, right? He is brought into the king's palace. He befriends his son Jonathan, but then the king gets jealous of him, and he wants him dead. So David moves from hero to zero, and he's on the run. And it tells us in 1 Samuel 27 that says David thought to himself, one of these days I will be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is to escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand. You see, David says, I'm taking my men and going to the one place that Saul's not going to come looking for me. I'm going to go to the land of the Philistines who they're fighting. This is the land of the Goliaths. In fact, David goes to the enemy camp in order that he might get away from this loneliness that's creeping in. And so what happens is David basically shaking his head. I mean, the king of the Philistines, he gives him this town called Ziklag, which is a pretty awesome name for a town. They allowed him to live there with his 600 men and his wives and his children. And I'm sure he's just shaking his head and he's just saying, how did I get to this spot, right? Now, some of you might even be in that spot. Like, how did I get here? Like, how did I land here? Like, what's happened in the last 6 months, right? But some of you, this has been working on you before the last 6 months. And the Philistines then forced David to fight with them. It's crazy. I mean, David hits bottom. He is now fighting for the enemy camp against Saul. But he hadn't hit bottom completely. You see, he's on his way down, and as he's getting ready for battle and getting his men to go and fight against his own people, he says that David is not trusted by the enemy camp. And so they said, you know what, you can go on back. You know, they left the women and children back in Ziklag. He said, just take your men and you guys can go on back, because they didn't trust him in battle. But then when they began to crest the hill to where their women and children, their wives and their children are, they can see smoke in the distance. When they see smoke in the distance, it's actually the city is burning. And when they get there, they realize that they're all gone. All of their wives and all of their children. And then David hits rock bottom. It says in 1 Samuel chapter 30, David and his men wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. You ever felt like that before? You know, here's one of my fears right now in the pandemic that we're in right now. One of my fears is that you become numb to the pain right now because you've lost a lot. Some of you who are freshmen in here, you lost your last couple of months of your senior year. You lost being able to walk across the stage in a place where a bunch of people can clap for you and holler at you, and you know that weird uncle could come and blow the air horn when you walked across and embarrass you. You know what I mean? You've lost that, and then you've lost this ability of not knowing whether or not you'd make it to the university, but because the administration really stuck their neck out and really went the extra mile to be able to make it happen, you've been able to come to school where a lot of people have shut down, and a lot of people aren't able to experience what you've been able to experience just in the first week. But then you're walking on eggshells because you don't know what's fixing to happen. You don't know what's going to happen in America. You don't know what's going to happen in South Carolina. And you've taken all these feelings and you continued to like push them down. And there's this loneliness that's so dangerous right now in your own life that when you get by yourself, the anxiety level that you're in can only be numbed by you scrolling a screen. David's 2 wives, it says in verse 5, had been captured. I won't even try to pronounce their names, but they were obviously good looking with the names there. David, it says, was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each one was bitter in his spirit because of his sons and his daughters. And this darkness closes in. Panic turns to desperation. Desperation moves into depression, hopelessness, loneliness. And in the quietness of the loneliness, listen now, Satan whispers in his ear. He probably whispers in your ear too. Satan will say things like, you're worthless. You don't matter. No one really cares about you. You thought you were a big shot, but you're not. If God really loved you, he wouldn't have let all this happen. And anywhere in this life, when we see death, loss, and destruction, we see the hand of Satan. And we know that because we see in John 10:10, where Jesus says, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. You see, anywhere where there's destruction, anywhere where there's brokenness, anywhere where there's death, Satan is in the middle of it. And if he's in the middle of it with you, he's laughing all the way to your death if he can get you there. And so David writes, Psalm 22 in verse 2, "Oh my God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer, by night and am not silent. But I am a worm and not a man, scorned by men and despised by the people. All who see me mock me. They hurl insults, shaking their heads. Do not be far from me, for trouble is near, and there is no one to help." Isolation that leads to desperation brings 3 options. And some of you might be here. Listen to the 3 options. Option number 1 is that you can quit. You just throw in the towel. You might be watching right now on your computer screen somewhere. And you might be willing to give up right now. You can quit. You can give up on faith in God and you can lose your life. He could have just quit and just sat back and just said, "Guys, just take my life. You know, I'm the one that brought this on you. Your wives and your children, they're burned up. You follow me over here. It's my fault. I just give up," and he could quit. Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weary and carry heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." Some of you need rest. You've been running at all cylinders. Do you know that teen suicide has almost doubled in the past 10 years? Why does your generation want to throw in the towel? You're the most affluent generation, by the way, that we've ever had in America. But you're the most anxious generation. You can quit. You can throw in the towel. You can say, I'm done. I give up. I give up trying. Or you can run. You see, David was good at running. I mean, he had run from Saul for a while now. He had escaped them. He could have run from his own men. He could have taken off, and they wouldn't have been able to catch him. In fact, he'd have hid out. He knew his spots. He could have he was an athlete, man. He could have run. You know, in my house, I've got a rule. There's no running in my house. Now, my brother's kids come over there, and they're obviously not as disciplined as mine, okay? And for some reason, the cousins come over, and they're constantly running. But in my house, you're not supposed to run. Because I know what happens when you run. I've got 3 boys, and they're constantly chasing one another. And if I'm in the house, you know, I'm laying down the hammer, right? You know, you can't run. Why? Because one of my kids got a stitch in his lip because he tripped and did a face plant on the toilet one time when he was like 5 years old. Another one almost broke his arm. I got another kid during the COVID. He's a senior. He had a Nerf war, and he was running around chasing his friends, and he took it outside, and then he jumped up and tried to shoot him over a chain-link fence, and he just didn't have the kind of, you know, the ups like he thought he did, and he cut his arm on the fence, 13 stitches. Thank you, COVID. Here we go. So, no running in my house, right? No running in my house. I'll tell you why. Because I know that whenever you go running in the house, you're always looking behind you. You're always looking behind you at what's after you. And a lot of times it puts you in a position where you're going to do a face plant. And some of you are running. Maybe you're running on fumes. Could it be that your frantic pace and constant connectivity actually diminishes your ability to build meaningful relationships? Could it be that your frantic pace and constant connectivity actually diminishes your ability to build meaningful relationships? What's it going to take for you to voluntarily turn this thing off? I mean, what would it look like if you just went do not disturb forever? You know what kind of power that is? All of a sudden now, you check it when you want to. You answer emails and texts when you have the time to, instead of it constantly buzzing in your pocket. Jonah ran. Moses ran. The prodigal son ran. They never found rest until they returned to God. So you can quit, you can run, or you can pivot. You see, this idea of the pivot is something that's happened right now, I think, in the midst of this pandemic in a variety of different ways, and it's manifested itself in a lot of different institutions. This ability to pivot, that we didn't think we could pivot in certain arenas and certain areas, and all of a sudden we've had to pivot. Well, you see, David was in a spot where he had an opportunity to pivot. And in verse 6, it says that David turned to the Lord. David found strength in the Lord, his God. David pivoted. And he starts to ask, should I chase those who destroyed our town? And if I do, will I find them? And God replies, yes, go after them and you will find them. And so David turns to God. And then he turns to his brothers. And he tells them, listen, let's go after that which we've lost. And they come up over the crest of this hill, and they had no idea what they were about to see. All of their children and all of their wives that they thought were dead were actually all alive, and David brings back everything. Nothing was missing. God is in the business of restoration. And what the enemy steals, God recovers, redeems, restores. So what do you need to pivot from? What is it in your life that either has you on the run? What is it in your life that has you wanting to quit? What is it in your life that's got you so lonely that you need to pivot and turn towards God? Fast forward 1,000 years to another defeated set of warriors, the disciples. They had hit rock bottom. For 3 years, the disciples had followed Jesus. For 3 years, they had heard about his teaching. For 3 years, they had thought that he was going to actually take over this Roman Empire. And so he would save them from this rule of the Romans. He would save them from this disgrace. He would be a valiant warrior. So when Jesus hung on a cross, his blood running down his face and dripping from his side, everything changed. John looked on with horror. Peter got the word that he was dead. And this movement that the disciples were going to be a part of with Jesus leading the charge seemed dead. And desperation set in. Look at the words of Psalm 22 again. Verse 7, his accusers hurled insults at him. Verse 8, they mocked Jesus. Let the Lord rescue him. Verse 14, all of his bones are out of joint. His body contorts as he loses his strength. He cries out that he is thirsty. In verse 15, his tongue sticks to the roof of his mouth. In Psalm 22:16, we see evil men. They encircle him and pierce his hands and feet and raise the cross as people stare and gloat at him. In verse 18, they divide up his garments as they cast lots for his clothing. And then Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? The Jews around the cross that day would have recognized those words as David's. But they would have known the rest of the story. They would have known that Saul was defeated in that battle. The Philistines were on the way to fight. They would have known that David would have been crowned king of Israel and would have gone on to defeat all the nations surrounding Israel, his victory solidifying him as the greatest king of Israel. This was the beginning of a psalm of victory in Psalm 22. And now they were looking at the eternal King of Israel who was paying their penalty on the cross. He was breaking the curse of isolation that first reared its ugly head in the garden. And no longer would man and woman be isolated from him. He was restoring the relationship between man and God. And listen to the end of Psalm 22. All the rich of the earth will feast and worship, and all who go down to the dust will kneel before him. And those who cannot keep themselves alive, posterity will serve him. Future generations will be told about the Lord. That's you. They will proclaim his righteousness to a people yet unborn, for he has done it. Come on, somebody. Listen, look at the cross. Jesus calls out to you in darkness and silence. Jesus gives you hope when you don't see a way out. Jesus redeems you when you are helpless to save yourself. Jesus saves you when your sin is drowning you and when all hope is lost. When you are all alone, when it's creeping in on you, you can have victory in the resurrection. You don't have to be lonely anymore. You don't have to be. Don't choose to stay in this state of anxiety, of loneliness, but choose Christ and let him radically shift you this semester. I want you to bow your heads where you are. I just want to, can we just have a conversation? With your heads bowed and your eyes closed right now, if you got some stuff in your life right now that's really causing you a lot of anxiety and some stuff in your life right now that's really making you feel alone, will you just raise your hand where you are? Just raise your hand where you are. I see you. I see you. I see you. I see you. If you're someone in here that came tonight, that might even come this morning, and you know that loneliness is there because Jesus is not the Lord of your life, and you want Jesus to be the Lord of your life, would you lift your hand up where you sit? Just lift it up and say, I want Jesus to be the Lord of my life. And maybe you're online right now, and you're watching this, and you just say, I've tried this my way, and it ain't working. And I want Jesus to be the Lord of my life. Will you raise your hand if you've gotten to the brink in the last 6 months where you just wanted to quit? Raise your hand where you are and just say, yeah, that's me. That's me. Yeah, I see that. I see you. Anybody here running from anything? Just raise your hand if there's something you're running from. Yeah, I see you. What about some sin in your life that you need to pivot from? And you know that it's drowning you right now. You're a believer, but there's some dark sin nobody else really knows about, and that's what's got you just riled up and lonely. There's some sin in your life you need to pivot from. Is that you? Just raise your hand. Yeah, I see you. I see you. I see you. So, Father, I just come before you right now, and I just honor you as King. I know that you are at work on this campus. There's a reason that you wanted these students here. It really had nothing to do with them having some college experience, or it might not even have anything to do with them getting an education, because they could potentially have done that online. It may be that you're up to something here because you want to see revival break out among a state, and you're going to use these college students to do it. It may be that there's some college students here that wouldn't have listened unless they came physically here on campus to the gospel. And there might be a short window of time. This pandemic has caused us to realize that there's urgency. we're only promised today, and so I pray that those who might need to confess Christ as Lord, that they might show up tomorrow. They might show up on Wednesday morning. That they might turn their life over to Christ before it's too late for them. And not just too late like they're about to die, but that it's just in time, that they don't miss out on something that you want them to do. And so, Father, for those who raise their hand, I want to pray specifically for them. Some of them express that there's some loneliness in their life. Maybe even some of this isolation is heightened it a bit. For some of them, they're ready to throw in the towel. There's some stuff they get to a point where they just can't take it anymore, and for some of them, they want to run. They might be running from something right now. For those few students that raise their hand, I just pray, Father, that they just stop running and pivot towards you, and then they just rest in you. And for those students and adults who would say, yeah, I've got some sin in my life, and it's time for me to pivot. It might be tough. It might be addiction that miraculously only you could bring cure to. It may be something so deeply rooted like prejudice and bias that it's going to have to be miraculous. So we just pray, Father, that you might hear their heart right now as they just openly confess that to you with their heart. That you would listen and forgive. So, Father, I just thank you so much again for the leadership here who allow students to openly be able to learn about the things of God, and they continue on a path with this university to make Christ the center, and they're willing to fight for it, and they're willing to fight for students to be able to be here. And I just ask, Lord, that you just give them wisdom as they continue to lead. We love you, Lord, and we want to honor you as King. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Before we sing a worship song together, I'm going to ask you to take your phone out, especially if you raised your hand tonight. Just take your phone out. Jody had a number that he gave, and if you were someone tonight that raised your hand and you want to talk to somebody, like this is for you that just want somebody maybe to sit down with you and pray with you. I guarantee you, if you text this to this number, if you get the number right, somebody's going to reach out to you and they're going to pray with you. Some of you might have some stuff in your life that it'd be really good for you to talk to somebody. And so take your phone out and then just open up the message, right? And then do new message, and then where it says to, you're gonna type this number in. It's 864 887 9130. 864 887 9130. And then you're going to type in the word, let's just type in prayer. Unless there's another special word. You got another word? Is that good? And that just lets them and triggers to them, hey, this is somebody that wants somebody to connect with them and pray with them. Let's stand together and let's worship.